Well, if we could be making our way to our seats, we will be beginning shortly our second session for Thursday. As mentioned earlier, the lectures on Thursday have to do with preparing for the coming of the kingdom, the fact that there will be a judgment. The other three lessons, beginning with this one, tell us what to do to prepare for that coming day. And so Jeremy Sweets is going to speak to us about being on the alert. And Jeremy graduated from Florida College in 1999, went on to get a Master's of Divinity from Lipscomb University in 2012. His primary secular work has been in IT. He's currently working in the healthcare industry as a manager of business intelligence, but he works with the Broadmoor congregation in Nashville. I had the pleasure of meeting him a few years back and holding a meeting there and having very pleasant discussion, talking shop, and so on. I found him to be very thoughtful and a good student of the Bible. And so certainly we look forward to his sharing the work of his labor with us. He has a wife, Jessica, and 4 children. And he has been laboring in the kingdom of the Lord for a number of years, has a special interest in biblical languages and Old Testament literature in particular. And a lot of that will certainly serve him well as he speaks to us about being on the alert. So at this time, we'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Any better? Test. All right. We'll try this again. Hello. All right. It's good to see you. I've been anticipating this lecture for a while, for a couple of years, as I'm sure most of the lecturers have. You know, there's a benefit and a disadvantage to going later. You get to see everyone else, but then you have to wait a little bit longer. But then you also get a little more intimidated. The lectures have just been outstanding, so I appreciate each and every lecturer. Dominic did an outstanding job. You get a little intimidated when you see all of that. I'm a little intimidated. I appreciate the history of these lectures. I know the Bible students, the preachers, the quality of the men that have stood up here and spoken, and so I'm really humbled and honored to be able to be here. I guess I'll let you in on what I'm trying to remind myself, and that is my job is really not to compete with those other preachers. You know, I was telling Neil yesterday, we're not in a competition. So my job is to preach the truth, to hopefully encourage you, and to bring glory to God. So that's my goal, and that's what we're going to try to do here this morning. Okay, be on the alert and be prepared. Be on the alert and be prepared. This is the message of the Readiness Parables, what I'm going to call the Readiness Parables. Now, most of these come at the end of Matthew 24 and heading into chapter 25, and there's 3 main parables that we find there. Now, there's also 7 passages. There's several partial parallels that we'll look at, but I'm going to focus on Matthew 25. And I thought that 3 parables and 7 passages just wasn't enough to fill my time, so we're going to look at the context of Matthew 24, one of those easy passages, right? Okay. Well, the parables here take place in the context of the Olivet Discourse. Now, in Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2, it says, as Jesus is departing, or as he is leaving, the disciples notice and make note of this, and I'll do a slide here. In Mark 13 and verse 1, they say, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Now, I don't know how far Jesus had gotten away from the temple, but I imagine that he was walking right past this or able to see it up close. And the disciples said, look at this amazing structure. Look what is found here. It's a little bit of a later time in verse 3 when it says that Jesus is on Mount Olivet, and so he is away from Jerusalem. He's looking over the Kidron Valley, and he's able to see the temple. He's able to see what is there, and that's when he gives this discourse. But the temple was a magnificent structure. Josephus has a lot to say about the temple, broader descriptions that's found there. He says of the stones that were made that they were white and strong. They measured 40 feet wide by 12 feet high by 18 feet wide. That's the size of a tractor trailer, right? That is huge stones. It's no wonder that the disciples said, "Look at this amazing temple." The letter to Aristeas describes the temple as so strong that no one could force his way into the precincts. Well, in verse 2 of Matthew 24, Jesus says, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Jesus gives the message that destruction is imminent. Destruction is imminent. And this is an amazing statement. I know at my house I've seen through our city a year ago, tornado come through. And there were bricks, and they were tossed one from another. But we're not talking about bricks with the temple, are we? These were massive stones. And Jesus says these massive stones, I can't even put my arms that wide. He says they're going to be tossed one from another. Destruction is imminent. Slide. Well, to introduce this subject of destruction, I want to introduce you to a man named John Douthit. John Douthit is my wife's grandfather. A good man, served as an elder in the church for many years. And from 1950 to 1972, he served as a bomber pilot in the U.S. Air Force. And I don't know if you know anything about American history, but if you do, you realize that those were pivotal times. Those were important times. That was right after World War II, heading into the Cold War. So World War II ended by the dropping of a couple of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were at about 15 kilotons apiece. But as the war ended, we find that the allies between the United States and Russia were no longer allies together, right? They became more of enemies. But the United States had an advantage. They were the ones with the bomb. They were the ones with the power. But in 1949, we find that Russia tested their first atomic weapon. And so now these enemies, where the wedge was driven because of social and political differences, these enemies now are starting to build up their weaponry, starting to build up their armor. In 1951, the United States goes from building an atomic bomb to a hydrogen bomb. And that's not measured in kilotons, but in megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than what had happened before. And so we find that these nations are beginning to arm themselves. They are beginning to compete, and there's mounting tensions over this. Well, that sets off the Cold War. John Douthit would fly missions in both Korea and Vietnam. And those were both to stop the spread of communism. It was not between Russia and the United States, but it was to stop the spread that happened there. One of the most important missions that he flew was called Operation Chrome Dome. Operation Chrome Dome. And this was a series of flights that would have 3 campaigns, one over Alaska, one to Greenland, one would go over to Spain, and they would have 12 flights a day. So men would be ready to fly. They would start flying. An hour or so later, we'd have men ready to fly. They would start flying. Now, why were they flying those missions? They were headed to a place where if they needed, they could drop bombs on Russia. And so he flew this rotation of flights. He was one of the bomber pilots that did that. You see, as the weapons got more and more, as the threat got more and more real, there was a real fear of widespread destruction. These bombs were getting so powerful that there was a real fear that this could end civilization. This could be the end of the world as we know it. Slide. So tensions get heightened until we get to when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was one thing for Russia way over there to have these bombs, but it's quite another for Cuba to have these bombs, to be close, to ally with Russia. And it was a scary time. And slide, we notice with this imminent destruction, what we find here is there are two messages that come out of this. During that time of this fear of widespread destruction, be on the alert and be ready. My mom was a 12-year-old girl living in Belglade, Florida, in 1962. And so that's South Florida. She talked about there's a lot of Cuban immigrants that were there. This was close. And I talked to her about that, and she told me about the fear that she had. They were going through the drills at school, what to happen, what to do if a bomb goes off. What are you supposed to do? And they were doing the duck drills and getting down and all of that. John Douthit was prepared. And he was so prepared that with 15 minutes notice, he needed to hear the bell ring and then have wheels up in the air. John Douthit was prepared. So with this idea of imminent destruction here, they were prepared because danger was here. Slide. I think this is the message that Jesus brings. And we are going to talk about Matthew 24, even though it is a complex passage and it's not really the parables per se, but it provides the context for what the parables have to say. So it's vitally important. Jesus says that destruction is imminent. Therefore, you need to be alert and be prepared. Slide. Well, with that, let's go back and look at that Olivet discourse. We start there with the disciples. And they have a question in verse 3. And again, this is as they have left Jerusalem. They're on Mount Olivet. They are looking out at the grandeur of the temple. And the disciples ask this: when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming in judgment and of the end of the age? Now, there's different ways to interpret this question, whether it's 2 or 3, but my understanding as I look at this is that they are conflating or combining the ideas of judgment here. The destruction of Jerusalem, which Jesus just said would happen, the tossing of the stones from one another, that could only happen at the end of the age, at the end of the world, because consider how magnificent these things were. So when and what will be the signs? Slide. So as we look at Jesus' response, I believe that he does not address a single judgment, but rather 2 judgments. While the disciples likely intended to ask about the event of the temple's destruction and the singular event with the end of the age, Jesus talks about 2 different judgments. And there's a lot that we could say on that, but in verses 4 through 35, we find the destruction of Jerusalem. And then in verses 36 through the end of 25, we see the judgment of the end of the age. And as I look at this, I make it look nice and neat, don't I? Isn't that great? We got very clear division that happens there. Well, if you align this with parallel context, it's hard to line all that up. It's difficult. And you also see a bleeding from one side to the other. Remember, these are both judgments that will take place. So there is a bleeding of themes and context. And on one side, we find this bleeding of this idea of be alert and be ready. Now, we're not going to be talking about the end of the world as imminent destruction. In fact, there's going to be a definite shift that takes place. Not imminent near destruction, but something else. And so, but that theme of be alert and be ready kind of bleeds over. On the other side, the theme that's going to transition to, instead of immediate destruction, is preparation for the king. Be ready for the king. And why is that? Because you don't know when he's going to come. And it's that factor that's helped me distinguish what's going on here. And that is, in the first part, in the destruction of Jerusalem, you find that there will be signs, discernible signs. And you will be able to see and read the signs and understand and know that this is coming. But what about the final judgment? In the final judgment, there will be no signs. You must wait for the master. And the message is not look for the signs and then get ready, The message is be ready, be prepared at all times. And so this idea of signs helps me distinguish these two parts. In Matthew 24 and verse 33, and I'll simply read that passage, that ends that prior section. Notice what he says. So when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. There would be wars, rumors of wars, tribulations, false prophets, false messiahs, abomination of desolation, and all these things would be signs. But notice as we move into verse 36. Verse 36. There it says this, but, notice the contrast, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. Slide. So what we find coming out of that then is this lead into the readiness parables. And these readiness parables are going to be sandwiched in between two statements of judgment. First of all, in that 36 through 44, where there is an analogy and a pointing to the days of Noah, just as they did not know when that rain would come. They were in marrying and having feast, and it came at an unexpected time. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And that coming of the Son of Man, which becomes that main theme, that's one of those things that bleeds back. We find the coming of the Son of Man a couple of times in that previous section. Again, it can be a difficult passage. But the point is, you will not know when the Master will come, when the Master will return. And so the conclusion of that section in verses 36 through 44 is this. Verse 42, there's two conclusions, just so we don't miss the point. Verse 42, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. And again in verse 44, therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Do you see the point that Jesus is making? Be on the alert and be ready. Slide. So then that leads us into these readiness parables. I'm going to get you to do slide, to throw down that whole list there. One more. Okay, so what we find here are common features. This is a cluster, just like Philip talked about with Luke 15, where there are three parables, but they're really blended into one with a singular message. That's what we have here. And so there are common features between all of these things. First of all, there is this, what Bloomberg calls a triad of characters. And so you find a master on top, and then you find good and evil servants. And that construct is going to be found throughout all of these parables. The master is going to, in each one of these cases, the master is going to depart and be away, and he's going to return at an unknown time. The servants are assigned tasks. They're given responsibilities until the master's return. And then when the master does return, we find that there will be rewards and punishment. These things will be doled out based upon how they have done their job. Okay, slide. I'm not used to saying slide. Sounds like I'm talking to a baseball player there. Okay, we can do all those. That'll be fine. So these are the parables that we're going to head into, the readiness parables. Let's begin in Matthew 24 and verse 45. And if you have your Bibles there, I'll be reading that text. Matthew 24 and verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. First of all, we begin this parable with the question, and it's a question that we need to answer. Who then is the faithful and wise servant? Well, we get the answer pretty immediately. The faithful and wise servant, the next verse says, is the one that is so doing when his master comes. That is, he is doing his job. Not some extraordinary feat, not something above and beyond. He is faithfully and consistently doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing. He is doing his job. Well, we might then ask, who then is the evil servant? And this is a little bit of a twist. Normally we have two servants, but as I read this, I see the potential in the same person. That is, that good slave could say to himself, my master is delayed. If he thinks in a different way about the return of the master, he may act in a different way. And so what he does is this. It says that, well, there's no accountability, at least maybe he seems to be reasoning, and he beats his slaves, and he gorges himself. Think back to the function here of what this servant was given. He was given the responsibility of providing the rations for all of the servants. That would have been a high honor, a respected individual, to be able to have care of the whole group of servants there. But he does just the opposite of his mission. He was supposed to care for the servants, and he beats them. He was supposed to provide food rations for the servants, but he gorges himself, and he drinks with drunkards. He is the evil servant if he thinks about the master in a different way and then responds in a different way. The second parable we see is the parable of the wise and foolish maidens. And I'll read this text starting in 25, verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom! Come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." Here we find a parable of a wedding feast. And to really fully understand what's going on, we have to understand Jewish wedding customs. And that is, there was normally 2 parts to a typical Jewish wedding. There was a part that took place during the day. And this would be a celebration where the family would gather together. They would exchange commitments. They would exchange blessings. There would be dancing and celebration. They would enjoy themselves. But then the nighttime, there would be a transition to the parents of the groom, where they would have the wedding feast. And the highlight of the night was when the processional would take place from the other place to the groom's house. And they would light their lamps and they would lead the way. You can imagine with the wedding how beautiful that would have been. I'm sure Sarah McLaughlin would have been playing on the side. It would have been a wonderful scene to see. The lights as they went through. Well, what appears to have taken place here is that the bridesmaids, the virgins, the maidens, they have accompanied the bride to the groom's house. But the groom has not yet come. This also would have been typical in Jewish weddings because the groom would have stayed behind and negotiated a dowry, the gifts that would take place with the groom's parents. And they took their negotiations seriously. Often the groom was delayed, which is exactly what takes place here. And so that's our setting. We find the bridesmaids waiting for the return of the groom. Now, they fall into 2 parts, don't they? 5 were wise. They were prepared. They were ready. But 5 were foolish. And so we find that when the call comes, the groom is here, the bridegroom is here, midnight, late, in a delayed fashion. When they hear that call, they scramble. The wise ones are ready, but the foolish ones are not ready. It's like they're there for that test and a pop quiz. They didn't know, they're unprepared. And so they say, give us some of your oil. Let us see the answers. Let us know what we need to do here. And the wise bridesmaids say, there's not enough. So they depart. Those that are wise are able to enter into that wedding feast, that celebration that was there. But those that are foolish, it says, they are shut out. They are not included. And the text concludes with this statement. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Do you see the message? Be on the alert, be ready, for you do not know when the master will come. And that leads us to the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. So we'll be reading Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. Matthew 25:14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had made 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Notice that this parable resembles the first parable in that we have a master who is departing for a long journey. And this would have been common at that time. And as he leaves, he doesn't entrust his servants with the care of the other servants. This time, he gives them his financial means to manage. A talent is, America's Got Talent. We talk about this idea of an ability or a talent we have. Everyone's got their own talent. That's not really what's being discussed here. A talent was a sum of money, and it was a large sum of money. 1 talent was worth 20 years of wages for a day laborer. So you might even think about a retirement nest egg. This is something somebody would have saved for a lifetime. So even the 1 talent man does not have a few pennies. He has a nest egg here, a tremendous amount of money. Well, notice that the servants approach their task that they've been given very differently. The first man, it says, got to work at once, and he traded for 5 more talents. And the second man does the same. He gets to work at once and trades for 2 more talents, doubling the investment. But the third man, it says, went and dug a hole and hid the money in the ground. There would be some sense of safety, security. At least I'm not going to lose what's here. And so he hides it in the ground. Well, when the master comes back, and it says he comes back after a long time, when he does come back, he settles the accounts. And we find that the first man steps forward and eagerly presents, here's the 5 talents, and I've also made you 5 more. And the second man steps forward and he eagerly presents, here's the 2 talents, I've made you 2 more. And the third man steps forward and he doesn't give a presentation, does he? He gives excuses. He says, the reason I did what I did is because of you. I knew you were a hard man. I knew that you were exacting. And so I did not want to risk. I did nothing, and I hid my talent in the ground. Notice that the first servant was called good and faithful, and the second servant was called the same. But the third servant was called wicked and slothful. And so we find the rendering of the accounts. This wicked and slothful servant was cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, as we look at all of these parables, I want you to understand that this is not just some interesting story. The master is not some mysterious figure out there, but the master is Jesus Christ. And he will return. And the message is, be alert and be prepared. Not because you've discerned the signs of the times and you know that he's coming in exactly 2 months and 14 days, 20 hours, and you get ready for that time. Not for that reason. You're not going to know the time. Jesus will come, and we need to be ready. I'll get you to do slide here. We're going to look at some lessons for today, and we'll stay right there. First lesson I'd like to look at is be watchful and alert. Be watchful and alert. As Christians, we can never lose sight of our Master's return. Let me repeat that. As Christians, we can never lose sight of our Master's return. 5 times within our text, Jesus echoes the refrain that that day and that hour of his return can neither be known nor expected. We cannot predict the time of his return. And as I've already stated, we may know throughout history that there have been many that have tried to predict. They have identified the day, the hour when they believe that Jesus is coming. And the sad thing about that is often they're charismatic people, they get a lot of followers, and there's a lot of excitement, but when that failure inevitably comes, there's disillusionment. Wait a minute, I thought this was supposed to come, maybe none of this is true. I think most of us have been taught the fact that we cannot predict the time, the day, or the hour. But maybe one of our dangers is not predicting, but dismissing. Not predicting, but dismissing. It is just as dangerous to dismiss the return of the King, to forget that it's going to happen. We may not know when the King is coming, but we need to act with the same sense of urgency as if he is coming soon, as if he is coming very soon. And this danger only increases with time, does it not? After all, it's been 2,000 years since this was spoken. And every day has gone on. I've not seen any difference. You remember in 2 Peter chapter 3, there were critics that were saying that, well, God has not come yet, therefore he's not coming. And that idea can seep into our minds so that we very easily dismiss the return of the King. And as I mentioned, this even grows with time. You might notice the parable of the talents. The master returned after a long time. After a long time. And so it's been a long time for us. But let us never forget that the King, the master, is coming. He will return in judgment. Therefore, be alert and be ready. Let us be vigilant and watchful. Let us have the excited anticipation of the wedding attendants. Let us echo the refrain, the statement of Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 22. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. Okay, slide. The next point we want to notice is that we need to be faithful in service. Faithful in service. The Readiness Parables promote faithful service, and it does this with both bad and good examples. So let's start with the bad examples. You'll notice that in the first parable, there is a demonstration of unfaithfulness through insubordination. That is, that the servant completely turns around on the task that he is supposed to do, and he does the opposite. Instead of caring for the servants, he lives in selfishness, and he gorges himself. That can be a real danger for us. We will be an unfaithful servant if we turn away from our mission of holiness and bringing glory to God to one of selfishness and sin and trying to bring glory to self. That is pure insubordination. In the second parable, the unfaithful maidens are simply inattentive. Inattentive. They have no forethought. They're not prepared. They're not thinking about what they need to do. Surely that would never happen to any of us, right? With our busy schedules, you got to pay bills at this time, we got to have the kids to practice at this time, and we've got to get over here, we've got to get over there, but we forget. We're simply not focused on that. I've got so many daily tasks I need to be reminded of. They were unprepared because they were inattentive. And third, in the parable of the talents, the unfaithful servant is inactive. Inactive. He lives in fear and cowardice and chooses to do nothing instead of something. Being a Christian involves being baptized and living the Christian life, but it's more than simply being baptized, isn't it? To be a Christian, you are a worker. And there's not options. You go, well, I want the non-working side. I just like the benefits. You don't get the option. To be a Christian is to be a worker, a diligent worker, and we cannot be inactive. Well, the good servants provide the flip side of that, the mirror image. The wise steward practices consistent, faithful service. Again, not some grand feat. This is not a competition between spiritual elites. It's not the Olympics where we're trying to outdo with our service of good one another. But we faithfully, consistently do what we're supposed to do. I've had the benefit of being a part of great churches, and I've seen godly men and godly women that the world may not know their name, they may not find their names in the papers, but they have faithfully, consistently served God. And that should be our goal. The wise maidens exhibit foresight, and they make preparations accordingly. Faithful Christians need this same kind of long-term vision. We have our heads down. We have our blinders on to the affairs of the world, and that's what we're concerned with. But we need to have long-term vision, and we need to make preparations. The wise stewards in the last parable, they act immediately, decisively, and eagerly. And that should be a description of us as Christians. Those that act, those that work. Okay, let's look at our last point here. Be motivated. These parables provide vivid pictures of what awaits both the wise and the unwise servants. And that should motivate us. The wicked servants meet a horrifying end. They are cast from their master's presence in a place of outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth. What a horrible end. And we need to connect those things. The pain and the suffering is because they are cast from their master's presence. Away from the master, there is pain and suffering. It's like a child that wants their mom and dad where there is comfort, but away from that, there's pain and suffering. A child needs their parents, and we need our master. The faithful servants and stewards, on the other hand, they are welcomed into their master's company. The wise maidens join the wedding feast with the bridegroom. They join the celebration. The resourceful stewards are told, "Well done, good and faithful servants. Enter into the joy of your master." And as Jonathan Caldwell brought up, one of his concluding passages was in Luke 12:35 through 40. There are so many wonderful parallels that we find here. I had to focus on these three for sake of time. But in that one case, we find that the master welcomes the servants in, and he takes up the robes of service, and he serves them. And he serves them. Jesus Christ came to serve us, to make us part of the kingdom, so that we can be part of the family of God. What an amazing, amazing picture. And I know I'm talking about motivation here, but that should motivate us to service. If the king could serve us, the lowly servants, surely we could serve our fellow brothers and sisters, the people of the world, and be servants of others. Yes, let us be motivated. Well, let me conclude with this. Christ will most certainly come again, and he will come to call us all into account. So let us be alert, and let us be ready for his coming. Not because we can predict the time, but because we have to be ready and alert at all times. And if we can be found faithful in his service, relying and trusting in his grace and his mercy, falling upon him with great service and love and devotion, we can be welcomed into the presence of the King. We can hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And so let us have that as our primary goal. Whatever other activities we may engage in, let us seek to be with the King. Thank you.